just a second. All right, folks, we've kept you waiting long enough. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first Saturday Streamathon Emergency Fundraiser series. Without further ado, I want to bring on good friend Ken Gerhard. I'm sorry, I keep mispronouncing your name. I love it both ways. See, Gerhard.
I've been called worse, Smiles. It's all good.
Well, I forget exactly how and when we met. It was probably at one of Chester Moore's Texas crypto conferences. Texas used to feature, 2 or 3 different cryptozoology conferences a year. It was a boon. It was Craig Woolheater's Texas Bigfoot Research Center was doing its stuff up in Jefferson, and that's still ongoing. Yeah. That kind of morphed into another organization. They split off. No secret, it's in his bio. But I've always said that if there's any real significant discovery in the field of Bigfoot research, I believe it's going to happen here in Texas, and there's a lot of reasons for that. It's mainly because I think there's some really good quality researchers like yourself and others here in this state of ours.
Kind of you to say. Well, yeah, we do. Texas does have a dearth of really top-notch Bigfoot and cryptid researchers. We're very blessed in that regard, no doubt.
So I'm going to. You've got some slides. I think we want to try to get that set up. Let's see. I can go ahead and add that to the stream and see if you can get those going there.
Let's give it a shot.
It's the infinite regress.
Okay, let's see here. And forgive us all. This is my ancient version of PowerPoint, and we've never run this on StreamYard before, so we'll see what happens here. But can you see that?
Not seeing it yet. Let me pull that back. So what we're seeing is your screen and your StreamYard screen, and I've pulled that down. I would go ahead and unshare and then try it again, selecting specifically the.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's try to share screen. Okay, let's see. Okay, there we go. That's there.
All right. Aha! I think.
Okay.
I think we have a winner.
All right. How does that look? Are you seeing the full screen?
Not exactly, but it's big enough. Unless there's a way to get it to the full slide playback. But I know we were having a little bit of challenge with regard to that. But if that works for you, we can work with that.
Yeah, it won't have as many bells and whistles, but hopefully if everyone can see the images large and clear, I guess that's the main thing. And
okay, well, I'll let you get started. Ken is a professional at this. He's been doing lots of media work in all the different cryptozoology oriented television programs. There's been this wonderful explosion of Bigfoot and cryptozoology television programming, and he's right there with it. He's also very active at the San Antonio Zoo, and I think he's doing great work. And so we're just so glad to have you, Ken. So I'm going to go ahead and get off here. If you need anything, I'll be right here.
Thank you, Smiles. Thank you again for inviting me to be part of your inaugural Streamathon 2020 for Anomaly Archives. Very proud to be involved in this. And good afternoon, everyone. As Smile said, I'm Ken Gerhard. I'm a cryptozoologist based in San Antonio, Texas. Cryptozoology, of course, is the search for evidence of undescribed animals, and that often includes many of our mythical beasts, including Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Chupacabra, and the Loch Ness Monster. Now, I do have an upcoming book, The Essential Guide to the Loch Ness Monster and Other Aquatic Cryptids. Hoping to have it out by the end of the year. So this is kind of going to be an advanced lecture that covers some of the topics that I cover in the particular book. Loch Ness, of course, we're talking about let's see here. Can you still hear me there? Okay, good. Yeah, Loch Ness is, of course, an iconic mystery, one of the most iconic cryptids that we have in our field. And what's interesting, of course, is that it relates to a number of other cases around the world. We have lake monsters, including the Lake Champlain monster, or Champ, of upstate New York and Vermont. In Canada, you have something called the Ogopogo and Lake Okanagan. And really, if you travel around the world, you find a lot of legends similar to that of the Loch Ness monster. And what's very compelling from my perspective is that the sightings, the eyewitness accounts, and that's really, we have to keep it real. The majority of evidence that we have within the field of cryptozoology for any of our cryptids, as we call them, our topics of investigation, is anecdotal evidence, eyewitness descriptions, reports, sightings, and also sometimes indigenous or aboriginal legends. There is very few, or there's very little, I should say, physical evidence. If you would consider things like photographic and sonar and things like that physical, they are controversial because they're not empirical. So you can't put them on a laboratory table and study them. So that's the problem. But we will talk about that, because in the case of the Loch Ness monster, there actually is quite a bit of evidence in terms of anecdotal, photographic, and also sonar evidence. And I'll be discussing all of that today. A lot of information to cover here. As you can imagine, it's a very complex subject with a lot of layers, a lot of depth, pardon the pun. And if I have time at the end, I'll try to take some questions if anyone has any specific questions out there. But anyways, this is not the official cover to my book that we're looking at here. This is kind of a place filler. I do have an artist, a really remarkable artist, working on the cover art, and hopefully that'll be out soon. But I thought this was a cool image, so I just figured I'd throw it up there. Not really an accurate representation of what the Loch Ness monster is supposed to look like, I don't think. Okay, so the first thing we have to address, of course, and all good cryptozoology really reverts back to zoology, and that's the important part of the word cryptozoology. So if we're addressing these problems of potentially undiscovered species, then you certainly have to address a number of the zoological questions that go along with that in order to make a case that these things might actually exist. So first, with regard to Loch Ness, it is about 22.5 miles long and about 1.7 miles across at the widest part. It's a very narrow lake, sort of long and narrow. Excuse me. So there's not a lot of surface area there, but it's very deep. The officially accepted greatest depth is 754 feet deep. There are unverified readings of over 800 up to 889 feet deep. So that equals out to 263 billion cubic feet of water. So it's often been said that you could fit the entire population of planet Earth within Loch Ness 3 times over. It's an immense amount of water. It's one of the greatest lakes in all of the United Kingdom in terms of water volume, perhaps in Europe. It's an oligotrophic lake. What that means is that it's actually very nutrient poor. As you might expect, it's very cold water, 47 degrees Fahrenheit in kind of the lower levels. The surface temperature might, bring the water on the surface up a little bit, the temperature up. But it never freezes. So it's a very cold lake. It maintains a constant temperature, never really freezes over. Because it's a nutrient poor lake, the building blocks of an ecosystem, which include things like algae and plankton. Plankton involves zooplankton, basically little tiny arthropods, crustaceans that live in the water, and also phytoplankton, which is vegetable matter, is very sparse because the lake is very cold, and also it's very peaty. And by peaty, I mean it's very dark and full of sediment. So imagine that Loch Ness was formed by basically a rift between 2 continental tectonic plates millions of years ago. And so it's a very deep, it's like a rip, a tear in the earth. And it filled up with ice during the last ice age, the Pleistocene. And then about 10,000 years ago, that ice melted and it filled up the lake. And it's maintained pretty much the same qualities ever since. But because there are very steep cliffs that kind of come down into the loch and it's very deep, there's a lot of peat and which is, moss and things and dirt that run into the water. And so the visibility is very poor in Loch Ness. In fact, you can only see about 10 feet down from the surface on a sunny day. So that's, that creates a lot of problems in terms of investigating the lake. There are estimated about 20 to 30 tons of fish total in the lake, including species like salmon, trout, eels, Arctic char, pike, and lampreys and things. But 20 to 30 tons is not necessarily a lot of fish in terms of the size of Loch Ness. So we have to consider these things. Loch Ness is also notorious for creating a number of weird mirages. Okay, there are strange currents. There's floating debris, trees and things, logs. There are things called seiches, which are created by wind, which are basically phantom waves. There are standing waves that can be left by boats long after the boats have passed. So there certainly is the potential there for optical illusions with regard to Loch Ness. And I'm sure that does happen in terms of alleged Nessie sightings. There are probably some cases of misidentification. Loch Ness is about 52 feet above sea level. It's connected to the North Atlantic by the Ness River and some canals and locks that are very shallow, but it is connected to the ocean ultimately, a few miles from the ocean. Now, one of the famous stories that is often connected to the Loch Ness Monster, and you'll hear this on pretty much every TV show that you watch about the Loch Ness Monster or Nessie. You'll read it in every book, is the story of St. Columba. St. Columba was an Irish missionary. And in the 6th century, late 6th century, he was in northern Scotland trying to convert the local people known as the Picts to Christianity. And there's a story that was written in his biography about a century after he died that stated that St. Columba was standing on the banks of the River Ness, not Loch Ness itself, but the connected river several miles away, and that he saw this terrible, he had sent one of his assistants out to retrieve a raft on the other side of the shallow river, and suddenly this great water beast appeared and threatened the man, to which allegedly St. Columba threw up his arms, made the sign of the cross, invoked the name of God, and drove this water beast off. Very famous story. So that, a lot of Nessie proponents will use this as evidence to push the first sighting of the Loch Ness Monster back to the 6th century. And they'll always say, oh, there have been sightings of the Loch Ness Monster for centuries. Well, in fact, this particular story is probably not as accurate as it's being portrayed. And according to a historian named Charles Thomas, this particular story was probably just a parable. And biographies of people like St. Columba from that time period were often embellished to display the the great power and influence of God and Christianity. So this was probably an exaggerated account. And again, it's not from Loch Ness, but from the River Ness, which is several miles away. And what may have happened is that the local people did encounter, and St. Columba did encounter, some type of aggressive animal, maybe something they weren't used to seeing, like a walrus or a seal. And so, my point being that we shouldn't necessarily take this particular story as a verbatim Nessie sighting. It has kind of the hallmarks or characteristics of a story that was maybe embellished, perhaps a parable. So the first actual sighting or recognized sighting of the Loch Ness Monster, at least the one that got the most notoriety and publicity, involved a couple named John and Aldi Mackay. And this is a picture of Mrs. Aldi Mackay later on in life. But according to the story, now you have to keep in mind that the year was 1933. And what happened in 1933, which was rather significant, was that a new road had just been constructed on the north side of Loch Ness. It's known as A82. And while they were constructing this new road, which ran right along to aside the Loch Ness, they cleared away a lot of the brush. So there was a lot of better visibility of Loch Ness than any of the locals had ever remembered. The other pre-existing roads around Loch Ness were you didn't always get a good view of the loch. They were kind of winding, and they moved away from the loch, and there were trees and things. So we had a great visibility of Loch Ness in 1933. And on April 14th, 1933, John and Aldi Mackay, who owned a hotel in Drumnadrochit, were driving from Inverness to their hotel, and Aldi here claims that she suddenly saw this great black beast thrashing in the water. And according to the accounts, she yelled out, "Stop the beast." And John couldn't pull over right away because he would have wrecked the car. But Aldi claimed that she saw basically two black wet humps. She described them as looking whale-like, or like a whale-like fish, kind of rolling through the water. And by the time John stopped the car, the humps had already vanished, but he saw this great wake that this thing had left. And they told about this encounter to their friend, a guy named Alex Campbell, who was a water bailiff, kind of helped run the fisheries there on Loch Ness. And he was also a correspondent for the local newspaper, which was the Inverness Courier. And so he wrote a story about the Mackay sighting, which was published on May 2nd, 1933. And that was the first time, and they actually referred to this thing as the Loch Ness Monster. And Alex Campbell discussed in the article how locals had long known about a strange water beast in Loch Ness. A lot of people didn't want to come forward and talk about it because they didn't want to be considered, a little bit nuts, maybe drinking a few too many pints. So, this was the first time that the Loch Ness Monster was kind of put on, into a newspaper headline. Now, ultimately, other things began to happen that year. Probably the next notable sighting to get a lot of publicity happened on July 22nd, 1933, but we didn't find out about it until months later. But it involved a guy named George Spicer, pictured here in this newspaper article, along with his wife. And George Spicer was a successful businessman from London. He and his wife were on vacation around Loch Ness at the time, or at least returning home from a holiday. And this was during the middle of the afternoon. And as they were rounding a curve in the road, George claimed that he and his wife saw this huge creature lunge across the road and right in front of them, several hundred yards ahead, and then slide down the embankment into Loch Ness. And according to George's description, which he had conducted some interviews and wrote some letters to local newspapers, this thing had a long neck. It's kind of like an elephant trunk. It was undulating. They couldn't really see a head. It had a huge body. It was gray. It looked very creepy. They called it it looked like an abomination. Loathsome was one of the words they used. And they only got a fleeting glimpse of this thing. And by the time their car had pulled up to the spot where they'd seen this creature, they could see where the vegetation had been kind of matted down and where this thing had cut a trail down to Loch Ness. Well, again, this story didn't really receive a lot of publicity until late in 1933, when the London newspapers began to pick up a lot of these local Scottish newspaper stories and give them wider circulation. And so this is one of the few rare, there's about 35 documented sightings of the Loch Ness Monster on land, which in my opinion is not very convincing, because when you consider there are well over 3,000 documented sightings of the Loch Ness Monster, and you only have 35 on land, that's a very small percentage. Animals, of course, are habitual. So you've got to ask, well, if these things come on land, why aren't they seen far more often? But nonetheless, this particular story helped propel, again, the Loch Ness Monster into worldwide fame. The first putative photograph of the Loch Ness Monster, or Nessie, was taken on November 12th of 1933, late that same year, by a guy named Hugh Grant. And Hugh lived in a local village called Foyers, right on the loch's edge. He was a welder, a fitter, as they called him, worked at a local aluminum plant. And every Sunday after church, he liked to take a walk along the loch's edge with a camera. And he was an amateur photographer, took pictures of a landscape and stuff. And on this particular afternoon, he claims that he saw something thrashing about a few hundred yards offshore, right on the surface. He snapped 5 photos, and ultimately he did not get the photos developed right away. This thing eventually submerged and he didn't see it anymore. He didn't get the photos developed right away because he was worried that they might not have turned out, and B, he didn't want to be considered, like he was pulling some kind of practical joke. He was afraid, as many eyewitnesses are, that people would not believe him, what he had seen. So, but anyways, eventually a few weeks later, his brother took the roll of film into town because curiosity was killing him. He wanted to find out what was on here. And only one of the exposures turned out. 4 of the 5 did not turn out. This is the one that turned out. It's admittedly not a very good photograph. You can see a long serpentine form sort of thrashing about on the surface of the water. So it was actually embellished a little bit by the newspaper too, which caused some people to become even more skeptical. But we have many, many photos of the Loch Ness Monster on record, most of them very controversial, not real definitive, but this is the first one that we know of. First alleged photo of Nessie. The most famous photo of Nessie is called the surgeon's photo. And this one was taken in April of 1934, but it has been subsequently proven to be a hoax. So this is the most iconic image of Nessie that most people think of. You can find it in tons of Nessie books, Loch Ness books from the 1970s, 80s, and onward. But the story behind this is, and it's a long story, but I detail it in my forthcoming book. There was a guy that had been hired by a London newspaper to conduct a hunt of Nessie in December of 1933. He hoaxed some footprints, got caught, got fired, was disgruntled, and decided he wanted to get revenge on the newspaper. So what he did is he had his friend construct a fake Nessie out of a toy submarine and a long dinosaur-like neck and head, which they attached to the submarine. They floated it out in Loch Ness, took some photos, and then because he knew that the newspaper would be, shall we say, skeptical of anything that this disgruntled monster hunter brought in, he actually got a front man for his little Ponzi scheme, and that front man was a respected London surgeon named Robert Kenneth Wilson. And he had him take the photograph and pretend like he took it, and the newspaper bought it hook, line, and sinker and published it on the front page of the newspaper. And so this is the classic image of Nessie that most people think of, but in the 1990s, the story was finally found to be a hoax, a fabrication. Now, we should also point out that sightings of the Loch Ness Monster of a long neck and a small head sticking out of the water like this are very rare. Only about 15% of Loch Ness Monster sightings describe a head or a neck. Virtually all sightings of Nessie are of a large hump, whale-like hump, about anywhere from 8 to 20 feet long, very wide, dark gray or dark in color, sometimes multiple humps, one after the other, and undulating in kind of a vertical fashion, and that's very important. So there are a lot of hoaxed photographs through the years that have been associated with the Loch Ness Monster, and you know, it's a frustrating aspect of cryptozoology, something that we deal with all the time, but we have to kind of, you know, separate the wheat from the chaff and figure out, you know, what evidence is credible and what evidence we can disregard. And then this is one of the last famous photos of the Loch Ness Monster, alleged photos, I should say. So again, it's controversial. This was taken on July 29th, 1955 by a London banker named Peter McNab, who was on vacation with his son. They were out here near the ruins of famous Urquhart Castle, very famous, iconic castle ruins there on the right there over the deepest part of Loch Ness. And they were out, and Peter saw something moving through the water, had a camera, grabbed it, put on a telephoto lens, and claims that he took this photo of this giant undulating beast. And you can, if nothing else, you can see that it has a lot of size, right? I mean, the Tower of Urquhart Castle, which you see there, is estimated to be about 65 feet tall. So this creature in the photo is presumably at least 40 feet long. Maybe it's two creatures, because you see multiple humps there. There have been some problems with this photo through the years. Peter McNab evidently gave different versions of the photo to different researchers that had slight differences with the shadowing and things. So, you know, there's been a kind of a skeptical view cast on this particular photo as well. And then this is a frame from the Dinsdale footage, and I'm sorry it's not playing the GIF here for us for some reason. I guess it's because I don't have it in the right mode, but this was shot, this is the first really convincing cinefilm that was shot of the Loch Ness Monster and Nessie, and you can find this on YouTube and other places if you type in Dinsdale, that's the guy's name, Tim Dinsdale film. This was filmed on April 23rd, 1960. Tim Dinsdale was a Nessie investigator who was at Loch Ness for about 6 days on his initial trip looking for evidence, and he was very prepared. He had a 16mm Bolex camera with a telephoto lens in his car mounted to a tripod. He had practiced using it very quickly and being very efficient with it. And one morning on the 6th day of his investigation, he claims he saw this giant hump moving across Loch Ness, looked at it in his binoculars, said it looked like the back of a buffalo or some animal, and began to film it with his, filmed about a minute of this thing with his movie camera. And you can see the bulge sticking out of the water. Now, unfortunately, he was several hundred yards, maybe 1,300 yards at least away from this thing. He was across the loch. So, but you can see, if you watch the film in its entirety, you can see this thing moving at a pretty decent clip. The footage was ultimately studied by the Joint Air Reconnaissance Investigation Center in England, which basically analyzes, it's a military branch of the military, the Air Force, that analyzes footage, and they determined that it was an animate object, that is a moving object, moving about 10 miles an hour. They said it didn't look like a boat. You can kind of see a shadow underneath the water, but there's also a wake that's being left. And at one point, what's interesting is that the bulge actually appears to submerge or disappear for a moment. Now, that said, again, this footage is controversial all these years later. It has been alleged by some skeptics that what Tim Dinsdale actually filmed that day was a boat, a fishing skiff about 14 feet long, and that the lighting was bad and he was so far away that he basically fooled himself into thinking it was the Loch Ness Monster. You can find some good articles and things online that kind of talk about the whole saga of the Dinsdale film. But if nothing else, in 1960, this particular incident, this film helped to revive interest in the Loch Ness Monster. Now here we have 3 images from the 1970s, and these are our first alleged underwater images of the Loch Ness Monster. In the upper left, we have something called the flipper photo that was taken in August of 1972. And basically, a group came in, and a group of scientists came in the 1970s, and they had these underwater cameras. They're called stroboscopic cameras because they had strobe lights, incredibly bright, that would flash, and then these underwater cameras would snap an image simultaneous to that. And this first image in the upper left-hand corner was said to be of a giant flipper. I guess you can kind of see a rhomboid flipper shape there. Again, controversial because the photo was enhanced somewhat, and the subsequent attempts to create a similar result with other enhancements have not duplicated this exact fin shape. And then on the the right, you have what's called the head and body shot, which you can see what looks like a small head and long neck attached to a body with possibly some appendages down there. And also in the lower left is something called the gargoyle head, and this is alleged to be the head of the Loch Ness Monster, which really doesn't look anything like what we would expect based on the eyewitness reports, the head of the Loch Ness Monster to look like. And again, both of these images are controversial. They were taken underwater. There was allegedly sonar contacts that kind of corresponded with these images being taken in June 19th, 1975. But again, not considered conclusive proof because, some have alleged that maybe these are shots of debris, a log, a tree. It's just not conclusive enough to say that it is the Loch Ness Monster. So in my view, the most convincing evidence of the Loch Ness Monster, aside from the thousands of eyewitness sightings, may be the sonar evidence. And through the decades, there have been a number of very convincing sonar contacts made with large animate objects in Loch Ness. Now, if you don't know what sonar is, basically what they do, and this technology has been around for a long time, is that sound waves are bounced through the water, and they reflect off of objects, and they return to the source, the transponder, and basically by using these sound waves, they're able to contact objects under the water and get a rough idea of their size and shape and so forth, and also the lake bottom and the sort of the topography of the lake bottom. So this is the first alleged Loch Ness Monster sonar contact from 1954, December of 1954, and this was taken by a Navy trawler called the Rival 3, the Peterhead Rival 3. And the blotch that you see that looks like a head is not actually a part of the contact. That's a blemish on the image that looks like a head. So we have to disregard that. But what we do see is what looks like a long serpentine-shaped body. This thing was moving under this particular trawler when they had the sonar contact. You can imagine that sonar technology was pretty crude in 1954. So this image is of a piece of paper that was printed out. They didn't have display screens back then, so there was a paper thing that printed out paper readings of the sonar contacts, estimated to be about 30 feet long. But that's the first of many that have been contacts that have been made under Loch Ness through the years, typically described as, again, animate objects moving around, 20 to 30 feet long. Sonar experts that have looked at a lot of these sonar contact images have ruled out the possibility of schools of fish, often saying that this looks like one large solid object. And again, the skeptics have theories. The skeptics have come out and said, well, these are logs that are floating under the water, or maybe they're masses of plankton or algae, or who knows. But they seem to look like large solid animate objects or animals. Sonar got a little bit better in the 1960s, and in 1969, a professor in England named Dennis Tucker from the University of Birmingham conducted an extensive sonar investigation at Loch Ness. He had a pier-mounted sonar unit, and he claims that he caught several of these large animate objects. Here you can see, again, these big dark masses that you see. Those are the sonar contacts. This one looks like it's kind of shallow, 30 feet deep is what it says. Additionally, also in 1969, when the first mini submarines were deployed at Loch Ness, there was a small submarine known as the Pisces that had a sonar contact, and they attempted to chase an animate object under Loch Ness, several hundred feet down. And then in 1970, forgive me, I'm getting a little bit parched here. In 1970, a sonar expert named Martin Klein, an American sonar expert, showed up with high-tech sonar units and did an extensive study, and also had a number of sonar contacts. So this has been an ongoing thing from the 50s, the 60s. Okay, and this one's from the 80s. So in 1987, in October of 1987, there was a thing done called Operation Deep Scan. And what some Loch Ness investigators did is they got a flotilla of about 22 boats, all armed with Lowrance X-16 sonar units. And basically the boats all lined up in a straight line and traveled across Loch Ness, and basically created a giant sonar curtain. So they were sweeping the loch, and the sonar units were programmed to pick up anything bigger than a salmon. And lo and behold, on the first day of this Operation Deep Scan, they did pick up, they had 3 contacts. This is the best one here that you see. It's kind of in the circle area, though. Still unexplained to this day. And what's interesting about Operation Deep Scan was designed to debunk the Loch Ness Monster. So they were trying to sweep the loch clean for science by proving there was nothing in the loch that they detected on their sonar. But on the first day, they did get 3 sonar contacts. To this day are still unexplained. And this was a huge media sensation in 1987. It made a lot of worldwide newspaper. There were like 320 media outlets at this particular Operation Deep Scan in Scotland at the time to cover the story. And again, sonar is getting better and better, right? So this is an image from 2011. This is a sonar contact that was captured. And this is actually the guy, what he did is he had no way to record what was on his screen. So he pulled out his cell phone and just snapped a photo of his screen. So that's why it looks a little bit weird. But you can see that long object there, that kind of snake-like object. This guy was named Marcus Atkinson, and he operates a normal tour boat on Loch Ness. And one day he just looked down and saw this giant shape on his sonar unit and had never seen anything like it before. So he took a picture of the image of the contact. And he actually won an award. It was kind of a publicity thing, but he won an award that year for the best Nessie, Loch Ness Nessie image. And then this is very exciting. We have some recent news from Loch Ness. This is a sonar image that's been in the news a lot lately. It was taken in September 30th of this year. And you can see the red lines there represent the bottom of Loch Ness, very deep, kind of the geography, if you will. And if you see that little blue crescent-shaped object there in that rift, that is an anomaly. And this was recorded by a guy named Ronald Mackenzie, who also operated a tour boat on Loch Ness. Again, he'd never seen anything like this on his sonar in years and years of being on Loch Ness. Managed to capture the image of the sonar contact and got in touch with a local Loch Ness investigator named Steve Feltham, who's probably the most well-known Loch Ness investigator these days. And Steve took it to the newspapers, and subsequently other skippers from other tour boats on Loch Ness have come forward and said that they've also gotten sonar contacts like this. So essentially, that's just a snippet of the sonar evidence. But as you can see, there have been a number of sonar contacts in Loch Ness through the decades, large animate objects described as being bigger than a fish, smaller than a whale, 20 to 30 feet long, moving around. And Yeah, so I mean, in my own mind, at least, this is very compelling evidence that there are very large animals in Loch Ness that have not been described yet. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the identities of the Loch Ness monster, and I might spend a little bit more time on this because there are a number of theories pertaining to the Loch Ness monster, or what the Loch Ness monster might be. And we really don't know. I mean, one of the things I often say in the field of cryptozoology is that there are no experts. We essentially, what we do in this particular field is we speculate. Because all of the evidence is very anecdotal, as I said, we don't have a body, we don't have bones, flesh, blood, DNA, the types of things that would solve these mysteries once and for all. What we have is are a number of eyewitness sightings, which are often very consistent and compelling. We have native legends, Native American legends. In the case of North American lake monsters, in Scotland there were legends of things called water kelpies, which were assumed to be water spirits, but they were often described as aquatic, horse-like in nature. And I'm not saying that these are horses, but animals that had features like horses. So we have a lot of that anecdotal evidence. And then again, we have things like sonar, and sometimes, if we're lucky, photographs and films. So basically, we have very little data to work with. So what I'm getting at here is that a lot of this is going to be speculation. Now, everyone is entitled to their opinion, and certainly anyone could speculate and come up with a theory. But what I do from my own perspective, what I try to do is look at these things from a zoological point of view. Cryptozoology, again, don't leave the zoo or the zoology out of cryptozoology. It's very important. If there are large, remarkable, undiscovered species on our planet, you have to be able to answer very pertinent zoological questions about, what these animals look like, what is their taxonomic distinction? That is, what species, what genus, what family are they in? What did they, are they ectothermic, endothermic? What do they eat? Where do they hide? How do they breed? And so on and so forth. Behavior patterns. So all of this stuff is very important. All right. So the most recognizable candidate for the Loch Ness monster is something called a plesiosaur. A plesiosaur is a large aquatic marine reptile that lived at least 65 million years ago. The lineage goes back perhaps 150 million years. These were not dinosaurs, but they lived alongside the dinosaurs. But they were archosaurs, so they were related to dinosaurs and birds and crocodiles and things. Imagine a giant turtle with a long neck and no shell. I mean, that's basically what you had, and a long tail. So they had the large body, they had the long neck, the small head, they had a long tail, they had 4 flippers or appendages. They lived in the shallow seas of the Cretaceous. Again, they're found frequently in our fossil record up until 65 million years ago. Because they were reptiles, we assume that they were cold-blooded or ectothermic. So they probably did not tolerate cold water very well. And in fact, most plesiosaur fossils have been recovered from places where, we had presumably warm, shallow seas of the Cretaceous. But it does match the descriptions of Nessie in terms of people that have described the small head, the long neck poking up out of the water. As you can see, the flippers on this thing have been stylized to look like the flippers in the flipper photo. In fact, this particular painting was done by a famous British naturalist named Sir Peter Scott. And he actually gave Nessie a scientific name, Nessoteris rhombopteryx, or diamond-finned wonder of Loch Ness, based on his theory and others' theory that the Loch Ness monster was an evolved type of plesiosaur. Now, from my own perspective, the plesiosaur theory is problematic because, again, from what we know about plesiosaurs, and keep in mind, we don't really know because a lot of paleontology is speculation. You're looking at fossilized bones and you're trying to paint a picture of a species, a living animal based on fossilized bones and where they're located and so forth. But Plesiosaurs were presumably cold-blooded or ectothermic. We don't know for sure. If so, they probably would not have been very active in cold water like Loch Ness. And they were also air breathers. Like all reptiles, they would have to come to the surface and gulp for air periodically. Now, certainly crocodiles and turtles can hold their breath for a while when they go underwater. But this is one of the theories of the Loch Ness Monster. I don't endorse this particular candidate to explain the Loch Ness Monster, but, you know, it is a popular candidate that has been around for many years, been suggested for many years. Now, another candidate that's probably a little bit more pragmatic is something known as a conger eel. Conger eel is a fish, of course. It's a large eel species. There are a number of conger eels known to inhabit Loch Ness. Most of the conger eels in Loch Ness are only a few feet long, 3 to 4 feet long. However, the largest conger eels that have ever been caught, and these have been caught in the ocean because eels are what are known as andronymous fish, meaning that they travel to the ocean and back into freshwater lakes and rivers. The conger eel can get to be up to 10 feet in length, possibly. I think these specimens that we're looking at are between the 7 to 10 foot range. But there are Nessie investigators who have proposed that there could be a monstrous eel or eels in Loch Ness that are anywhere from 12 to 15 feet across. It's hard to imagine an eel getting any bigger than 12 or 15 feet long. And eels, of course, are very, very serpentine fish. We know that there are eels in Loch Ness. Do they get to be this big? It's really just a theory. There's no evidence that eels in Loch Ness can get to be anywhere this large. And moreover, from my perspective, eels don't really, they match some of the eyewitness descriptions of the Loch Ness Monster might be describing big eels, but the vast majority of Loch Ness Monster sightings which describe a big hump or multiple humps undulating through the water in a vertical motion. And again, that's important, because mammals, aquatic mammals, will move vertically through the water, things like otters and seals. Fish and reptiles go horizontally when they undulate, if we're talking about snakes and eels and things like that. So how would the body of an eel explain a giant hump or humps? How would that explain the people that see the head come out of the water? Because obviously fish can't really stick their head very far out of the water. So, but it is a theory. And then this is kind of an outside the box theory with regard to the Loch Ness Monster, but some people have suggested that the Loch Ness Monster or Nessie may be an amphibian, perhaps a giant salamander. And what you're seeing here is a very rare book from 1934, Home of the Loch Ness Monster, where a local Nessie investigator first proposed that the Loch Ness Monster may in fact be a giant species of salamander. There are species of salamanders in Japan and China, critically endangered at this point, unfortunately, that can get up to be 5 feet long. They're the largest known amphibians on the planet. Now, the thing about amphibians is that unlike reptiles, amphibians can actually hold their breath, or I should say they can derive oxygen from the water through their skin. So unlike a reptile, which theoretically has to come to the surface and gulp for air, amphibians actually do something called cutaneous respiration, where they absorb oxygen through their skin, and also they can exchange the gases back and forth. So presumably an amphibian would not have to come to the surface as much as a reptile to breathe, so they wouldn't be seen as often. Also, amphibians are, for whatever reason, can tolerate cold water much better than reptiles. So these Chinese and Japanese giant salamanders actually prefer living in cold water streams. If you travel as far north as places like Alaska and northern Scotland, you can find amphibians, frogs, and salamanders and things that can tolerate that cold water. So behind the book cover here, you see a reconstruction. And again, I apologize, my slideshow isn't working just as I would want here. You can see more of it. But during the Carboniferous period, the age of amphibians, 300 and 350 million years ago, there were amphibians, aquatic amphibians on our planet called the Embolomeres. and specifically a species called Eogyrhinus that could reach a length of about 15 feet. So in the fossil record, there are amphibians that can get to be up to 15 feet in length. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that an amphibian or a relic species like an embolomere might still be around. Maybe this might have a little bit more substance than the plesiosaur theory, but people certainly aren't as aware of this particular theory. Pardon me. And then we also have to consider that the Loch Ness Monster might be something completely unexpected. Perhaps something like an invertebrate. That's one of the theories that's been out there for years, is that the Loch Ness Monster is actually a giant sea slug, massive proportions, or something like this thing here, which is known as a giant sea salp or a pyrosome. And this is actually a picture. These things live in the ocean, these pyrosomes. This is a colonial organism. So this is not one living thing, but this is hundreds or thousands of small things called sea salps that basically connect to each other, and they form this giant, long colonial organism, and they kind of drift through the ocean. Pretty weird stuff. But, you know, a lot of people don't see these things or aren't aware of things like sea salps or even mollusks. You know, like, you know, you think of a slug, they're not very big, but then consider the giant squid, which is the largest invertebrate, the largest mollusk in the world. And the giant squid, which was only discovered in the 19th century, I mean, they can get to be up to 40, 50 feet long. So, I mean, you know, in the water, if something is not a vertebrate, that is, if it doesn't have a skeletal structure, you know, the sky is the limit. I mean, these things could theoretically get as big as they want. So again, these are kind of far out, kind of outside the box theories, but we don't really know. So we have to certainly consider all of the possibilities. And then this is probably my favorite candidate for the Loch Ness Monster, and one that I present in my new forthcoming book, The Essential Guide to the Loch Ness Monster and Other Aquatic Cryptids Worldwide. Now, this is not my theory. It's been around for many years. But I think, from my own perspective, based on the evidence, which again is mostly the eyewitness sightings, the anecdotal accounts, and also the sonar contacts and some photographs, that the Loch Ness Monster is neither reptile, nor amphibian, nor invertebrate. I think that Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster, is a mammal, an aquatic mammal. Okay? And the reason I say this, there are a number of reasons. One is that again, we talked about the water temperature at Loch Ness being very cold. Well, mammals, of course, are endothermic or warm-blooded and can actually maintain a higher body temperature, and it can actually tolerate colder water much better and be more active in cold water. And you can certainly look at whales out in the ocean, seals and sea lions and walruses as examples of animals that can tolerate cold water. In terms of the Loch Ness Monster, I think what we may be dealing with is a very primitive, ancient, prehistoric type of whale. Now, what a lot of people aren't familiar with is the fact that 20, 30 million years ago in whale evolution, there was a distinct split in whale evolution. One line descended into the modern whales that we know and love, the sperm whales, the blue whales, beluga whales, so on and so forth. But there was another line that went extinct, presumably, that were very long and serpentine, very long, skinny bodies. And these whales were known as archaeocetes. And specifically, this is a theory known as Basilosaurus. Now, Basilosaurus, we know from many fossils that have been found, particularly if any of the listeners out there are in states like Alabama, Mississippi, the Carolinas, you might go to the local museum and be able to see some Basilosaurus fossils. It was a long snake-like whale. It had very long, sharp teeth. It was a carnivore, a predator. It had the classic whale-like tail, which is the horizontal fluke tail. It did not have a dorsal fin. It had two appendages towards the front of its body, and then two sort of smaller appendages towards the back. And these animals probably again, we're speculating, it's paleontology, right? But because they had a long body with a lot of vertebrae, and because they were mammals, we think that they vertically undulated through the water. Their bodies probably went up and down like this. The other thing to consider is that these snake-like whales probably had skin like modern whales, kind of a smooth mammalian skin. And that is what a number of Loch Ness eyewitnesses have described whenever they've seen. Remember Aldi Mackay, our first Loch Ness sighting from 1933? She was one of the first witnesses to say it looked like it had a whale-like texture to its skin. And I've found that repeatedly through the course of my research, whether you're talking about the Loch Ness Monster or the Lake Champlain Monster or Ogopogo or any of the other lake monsters described around the world. People always describe this smooth whale-like skin, and some people have even described the tail, if they've been lucky enough to see the tail, as looking just like the tail of a whale. Again, a flute tail, a billabate tail that's kind of horizontal. Now, how the heck could a whale get into a lake? Well, that might be your next question. Well, in fact, most whales do live in the ocean, of course. However, there have been documented examples of whales getting into lakes or getting into fresh water, getting into rivers mostly, sometimes lakes if they're lucky. Beluga whales or pilot whales are a prime example, sometimes killer whales, gray whales. So, because these are obviously not, they're not fish, they're mammals, so they're able to adapt, eat more easily from a saline saltwater environment, perhaps to a freshwater environment. Some fish can do that, like some sharks and sturgeon and salmon, but they have to have an adaptation for that. The other thing I want to point out is that these animals have, and this is a completely subjective thing I'm putting out there, okay? But if you look at a lot of the descriptions of lake monsters around the world, often eyewitnesses that see the head will describe the head as looking, quote unquote, horse-like. And again, that doesn't mean that we have a species of horse that lives underwater. Okay, I'm not going there. But what I'm saying is that there's something mammalian about the head. And again, if you look at the reconstruction of this head of Basilosaurus, it's kind of got a flat head, roughly shaped like a horse. I know it's got sharp teeth, but ignore that. Maybe the mouth is closed. It has small eyes on the side of the head. No ears, of course. Some people have described a mane of hair running down the back, and now we're getting into some really wild speculation with these animals. Actually, could they have had hair still? I mean, they're mammals. These are early aquatic mammals, so they had recently evolved from artiodactyls and other hoofed animals into whales. Did you know that, by the way, that whales presumably evolved from artiodactyls or hoofed animals? They probably shared a common ancestor with hippos millions of years ago and so forth. So anyways, so yeah, this is kind of where my thought process leads me, that these giant relict prehistoric whales, if they exist, they've lived beyond their presumed extinction date of a few million years ago. They still live in the ocean, perhaps at great depths, and perhaps sometimes they do travel into fresh water, into rivers and lakes that are connected to the ocean. It's a theory, but the way that my new book is written, I try to present the information as objectively as possible, as accurately as possible, and ultimately it's up to you, the reader, to make your own determination as to whether you think the Loch Ness Monster might exist. Maybe it doesn't exist, who knows? But look at the evidence, consider the theories, and one last thing I want to say is that, again, the book is primarily about the Loch Ness Monster, but I do cover the Lake Champlain Monster or Champ. I cover Ogopogo in Canada. I cover sightings in the ocean of things known as quote unquote sea serpents, which I believe are the same animals that are sighted in Loch Ness, and also a number of lake monsters and aquatic cryptids around North America and all over the world. So, anyways, I don't know if I have a few minutes left, Smiles. I could take a few questions, or it's really up to you.
Well, so we're right at the time for our next speaker, and I still have fundraiser housekeeping to do. But I do want to, of course, encourage folks to support you through your website, kengerhard.com, and the PayPal that's there on the screen. And
Thank you.
You know, Ken's out and about a lot, so you know, safely, of course, during these times. But you can find out more about him and see him on these amazing different cryptozoology and Bigfoot programs that he's done. I will quickly just note that we did have some commentary, as one viewer says, every photo will be controversial until the creature is proven to exist. I want Nessie to exist, though. I sure do too.
Absolutely.
And I described it, Nessie and Lake Monsters, as my kind of gateway cryptid drug. I mean, obviously Bigfoot Patty first, but still, that was those early books were very much that. And of course, Red Pill Junkie commenting, well, let's don't discount those other types of skin that are described. And one of our volunteers, Victor Criterion, are there any new updates? Not going to have time to answer this question.
Yeah, I covered in the book. I cover the DNA study in the book. It is interesting. So.
All right. Well, folks are saying they're going to get it, so can't wait to see it. And we'll get copies for the Anomaly Archives, both for our reference section and our lending library section. And yes, the pandemic effect, the lockdown effect on everything. Sorry, RPJ, we're not going to have time to actually get too much into the questions here. But thank you so much, Ken. I can't wait to see you in person again, and really appreciate your help in supporting the Anomaly Archives during our emergency Streamathon fundraiser.
Thank you, Smiles, and a huge thanks to everyone that tuned in today. My book will be out in a few weeks, hopefully by the end of the year. Look for it on Amazon, The Essential Guide to the Loch Ness Monster.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All righty. So let me do some little housekeeping here. So for those, if you're not familiar with the Anomaly Archives, we are a 501c3 nonprofit lending library and archive located here in Austin, Texas. And you can go to our website where you can see a lot of information about us and the organization. It's all directing to the Streamathon page right now, which of course is going to be happening every Saturday between now and the end of the year. That's 5 weeks, 6 days of 8+ hour, well, about 8 hours a day of streaming content, lectures by various anomaly-oriented researchers. And we just launched our new merch shop, and you can go there and find out. You can see a lot of great products, including various things made from RPJ, Red Pill Junkie, his Absurd by Design company. Let me see if I can find. There we go. So here is some examples of the awesome stuff, the merch you can get there. We got your coffee mugs, we got your T-shirts and whatnot. This is some great art that if you've been to the website, you've already seen the web version of it. There's posters and mouse pads and all that sort of thing. But you didn't come here for that. But we would love for you to partake of that if that's your thing. I know I'm going to be probably getting a hoodie and T-shirts and mouse pads and coffee mugs because, man, I drink a lot of Java. Okay, we're going to be back in just a moment. Walter, I won't keep you long. And folks, Walter's coming up right away.